Hi students, welcome to Year 11 Biology and Module 3 Biological Diversity. This is video number 14 and we're going to be having a look at divergent evolution. In this particular video we're going to carry on the theme that we've looked at previously, which is to be able to explain using examples how Darwin and Wallace's theory of evolution by natural selection accounts for divergent evolution. As before, we've tried to give you some different levels of success, and of course the clue here is in how much depth you want to include in your responses. So as long as you can define divergent evolution, that's the real entry level. If you can use an example to help you demonstrate your understanding of divergent evolution, well, that's a slightly deeper level. And then if you can use what you learned from convergent evolution to draw a contrast with divergence and use the terms analogues and homologues, this is demonstrating a greater depth of knowledge. So let's have a look at each of these concepts. Garner, in her Blitzing Biology book, described divergent evolution as organisms that are closely related to Garner, in her Blitzing Biology book, defined divergent evolution as organisms that are closely related, developing different traits through natural selection. What she's getting at here is the fact that from a common ancestor, at some time in the past, different groups have diverged, have split apart from one another. They were closely related, they can trace their ancestry back to a common ancestor, but different traits have developed due to different selection pressures. And that's something that we've been talking about quite a lot in this particular topic, is the sorts of selection pressures that impact on populations and shift the balance of genes in favor of one particular trait or another. This divergence is what we need to look at, and we also need to see if we can find some examples to help us to make this point really clear. So let's look at this. It's something that we've talked about previously, something that we looked at when we were doing the dissection of the chicken wing, and it's about the pentadactyl limb. Pentadactyl limb, penta means 5, so this is a limb with 5 fingers, and you can see from the human example, this is our hand, so it's our forearm and our upper arm. And you can see there's one bone here, the humerus, there are 2 bones here, the radius and the ulna. There's a little cluster of carpals, a little cluster of bones in the wrist, and then we have metacarpals and phalanges, which are the rest of the bones that make up my whole arm. You can see if we look at the structure of cats and whales and bats, all of which are also mammals, that they have the same organization of bones. That one upper arm bone, the 2 forearm bones, the little cluster of bones around what we would regard as our wrist, and then those other bones that come away towards each of the individual fingers. But the way that these look in a cat or a whale or a bat are very different. The selection pressures that have acted in order to cause these organisms to look the way they do have been reinforced by changes that have occurred in the length, in the width, in the strength of each of these individual bones. So together they make up the fluke of a whale, the wing of a bat, and the running feet of a cat, as well as the forearm of a human. And in fact, we can take the pentadactyl limb even further and look at some examples from other organisms like birds or reptiles. Each of these is indicative of common ancestry. We actually call these homologous structures, or homologs. Homologous structures indicate common ancestry because they suggest some common organism in the history of each of these organisms that all possessed this organization and from which adaptive radiation has occurred. That is, modifications have happened in each of these different types of environments to make each of these organisms better suited to the environments in which we find them. So to look then at analogues and homologues in just a little bit more detail under that sort of general heading of common ancestry. So when we look at homologues, we say yes to common ancestors. Homologues do indicate common ancestry because they're body parts that are built from a similar framework, from a similar basic plan that was suggestive of a common ancestor that has become specialized for swimming or flying or running or whatever that particular function may be for those structures. But we can still see evidence of the original basic plan. This is divergence. So divergent evolution indicates common ancestry. Analogues, on the other hand, do not. So we looked in a previous video at analogous structures like the streamlined body of a fish, of a dolphin, and even of an ichthyosaur. And we found that the shape of these bodies were very, very similar. And we conclude that possibly the same sort of environments have created the same sort of selection pressures and therefore driven evolution in a similar sort of a way in groups that are not related to one another. These are just body parts that seem to have converged, that have a similar purpose, but are not an indication of common ancestry. So when you're analyzing convergent and divergent evolution, when you're looking at examples of different types of organisms and the structures that are present, what we need to look at is to see whether or not what we're looking at is suggestive of common ancestry and divergence, or of similarities, the fact that birds, insects, mammals all have wings for flight, but the way that they've developed those wings has developed independently of one another. And that, of course, would be an analogue. We'll look at some more examples in class, but this is just a quick introduction to give you a bit of an overview of the difference between these two very important terms. Thanks for watching.